In the late 1990s, New York City was buzzing with energy. Skyscrapers stood tall against the skyline, and people hustled day and night chasing their dreams. Among them was a man named Charles, a self-made millionaire who had climbed his way to the top through sheer determination, or so everyone thought. Charles wasn't just ambitious. He was also known for being ruthless in both business and personal matters. He ran his company like a king ruling over his kingdom, making decisions without hesitation or remorse. Charles lived a life many envied. His penthouse apartment overlooked Central Park, his suits were tailored to perfection, and his social calendar was always full of glamorous events. But behind the polished exterior lay a man who didn't value relationships much. To him, people were either assets or obstacles, nothing more. That mindset served him well in business but left a trail of broken connections in its wake. One evening, Charles attended a gala hosted by his own company. The room sparkled with chandeliers, laughter filled the air, and waiters moved around, offering champagne on silver trays. It was there that he met her, a woman whose presence seemed to command attention without effort. She wasn't flashy or loud. Instead, she carried herself with quiet confidence. Her name was Evelyn, and she worked as a marketing executive at one of Charles's subsidiaries. Evelyn wasn't new to the corporate world. She had fought hard to earn her place in an industry dominated by men. Growing up in a modest household, she learned early on that opportunities weren't handed out, they had to be seized. So when she landed a job at Charles's company, she threw herself into her work, determined to prove her worth. Over time, she became known for her creativity, sharp mind, and ability to handle pressure. That night at the gala, Evelyn caught Charles's eye during a conversation about upcoming projects. He admired how passionately she spoke about her ideas, and before long, they found themselves deep in discussion. What started as professional admiration slowly turned into something else. They began spending more time together, first discussing campaigns over coffee, then sharing meals after work hours. Their connection grew stronger with each passing week. For once, Charles felt like he'd met someone who truly understood him. Evelyn, too, believed she saw glimpses of vulnerability beneath his tough exterior. Love blossomed between them, though neither voiced it openly. Instead, they let actions speak louder than words. Late-night phone calls, stolen moments in empty conference rooms, and lingering glances became part of their routine. But fate has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. One morning, Evelyn woke up feeling uneasy. At first, she brushed it off as stress from work, but the symptoms persisted. Finally, curiosity got the better of her, and she bought a pregnancy test. When 2 pink lines appeared on the stick, her heart skipped a beat. She was going to be a mother. Evelyn wanted to share the news with Charles immediately, but doubt crept in. Would he react positively? Or would he see this as a complication in his carefully planned life? After days of deliberation, she decided to tell him anyway. Surely, if their relationship meant anything, he would stand by her side. The meeting took place in Charles's office late one afternoon. The sun cast long shadows across the floor as Evelyn sat across from him, clutching her bag tightly. With trembling hands, she revealed her secret. At first, Charles stared at her blankly, processing what she had said. Then came the reaction. She feared most anger. How could you let this happen? He snapped, his voice rising. You knew I wasn't looking for this. His tone dripped with accusation, as though she had deliberately set a trap for him. Evelyn's cheeks burned with shame and disbelief. This isn't something I planned, she replied, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. It happened because we were together. Don't you care about us? But Charles wasn't listening anymore. Panic clouded his judgment. A child would complicate everything: his reputation, his freedom, his plans. Without another word, he made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. The next day, Evelyn received an email informing her that her services were no longer required at the company. The reason given was vague: performance issues. Devastated and humiliated, Evelyn packed her belongings and left the building. Under the watchful eyes of colleagues who whispered behind her back, some pitied her. Others speculated cruelly about what might have gone wrong. But Evelyn refused to crumble. She may have lost her job, but she still had her dignity, and now she had a baby on the way. With nowhere else to turn, Evelyn moved to a quieter town outside the city. There, she started rebuilding her life piece by piece. She rented a small apartment, enrolled in online courses to sharpen her skills, and eventually launched her own consulting business. Raising her son alone wasn't easy, but every challenge only strengthened her resolve. She vowed never to rely on anyone again, especially not someone like Charles Dodd. As the months passed, Evelyn poured all her love and energy into raising her child. Though fatherless, her son grew up surrounded by warmth and encouragement. Evelyn often told him stories about overcoming adversity, hoping to instill resilience in him. Little did she know, destiny had other plans for her family, and one day the past would catch up with them in ways neither of them could imagine. Years rolled by, and life kept moving forward for Evelyn and her son. The small town where they settled became their sanctuary, a place far removed from the chaos and betrayal of the big city. Evelyn threw herself into her work, determined to build a stable future for her child. She started small, offering marketing advice to local businesses from her home office. Word spread quickly about her talent, and soon she was juggling multiple clients. Her hard work paid off when she saved enough money to rent a modest storefront. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. She painted the walls a warm shade of blue, hung up motivational posters, and set up a desk that faced the street so she could watch the world go by while brainstorming ideas. Her little agency grew steadily, fueled by her creativity and relentless drive. Within a few years, she expanded her team, hiring young professionals eager to learn from her experience. Meanwhile, her son was growing into a remarkable young man. From an early age, he showed signs of being bright and curious, always asking questions and soaking up knowledge like a sponge. Evelyn encouraged this thirst for learning, filling their home with books and enrolling him in extracurricular activities. Whether it was solving math problems or building model airplanes, he approached everything with focus and determination, traits he seemed to inherit from his mother. As he got older, he developed a keen interest in finance and economics. He spent hours reading about markets, investments, and global trade. Evelyn noticed how naturally numbers came to him and suggested he consider pursuing a career in business. At first, he hesitated, unsure if he wanted to follow such a competitive path. But after volunteering at a local nonprofit that helped low-income families manage their finances, he realized he had a knack for helping others navigate complex systems. That's when he decided he would study finance and use his skills to make a difference. Evelyn beamed with pride as she watched him graduate high school at the top of his class. His acceptance letter to a prestigious university in New York City arrived shortly after, and though it brought excitement, it also stirred up old emotions for Evelyn. Returning to the city meant confronting memories she had worked so hard to bury. Still, she couldn't deny her son the opportunity of a lifetime. With a mix of hope and trepidation, she packed his bags and sent him off to chase his dreams. College proved to be everything he hoped for and more. Surrounded by brilliant minds and endless possibilities, he thrived academically and socially. He joined clubs, participated in internships, and even landed a part-time job at a financial firm during his junior year. His boss recognized his potential early on and took him under his wing, teaching him the ins and outs of the industry. By the time he graduated, he had already built a solid network of mentors and peers who believed in his abilities. After graduation, he secured a position at one of Manhattan's leading financial firms. It was a dream come true, an opportunity to work alongside some of the brightest minds in the field. Little did he know, however, that this decision would bring him face to face with a chapter of his family's history he knew nothing about. Back in the quiet town, Evelyn continued running her agency, which had now grown into a well-respected name in the industry. Clients praised her innovative strategies and dedication, and her employees adored her leadership style. Yet, despite her professional success, there was always a shadow lurking in the corners of her mind. She had never told her son the truth about his father. For years, she avoided the topic altogether, brushing off his occasional questions with vague answers like, "Your dad wasn't ready for parenthood." She convinced herself that keeping the secret was for the best. After all, what good would it do to drag up painful memories? But deep down, she knew it wasn't just about protecting him, it was also about protecting herself. Facing the truth meant revisiting the humiliation and heartbreak she endured all those years ago. And yet, as her son ventured into the same world that once betrayed her, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that fate might have other plans. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table reviewing client proposals, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from her son, updating her on his latest project. Reading his words filled her with pride, but also a pang of guilt. How long could she keep hiding the past from him? She sighed, pushing the thought aside for another day. For now she focused on the present, the thriving business she built, the loving son she raised, and the life she created despite the odds stacked against her. Unbeknownst to both of them, miles away in a sleek skyscraper overlooking the city, Charles remained, oblivious to the ripple effects of his actions decades earlier. Life had been kind to him since then. His company flourished, his wealth multiplied, and he maintained his status as a powerful figure in the business world. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. His relationships were shallow, his friendships transactional, and his personal life devoid of genuine connection. Charles often found himself staring out the window of his penthouse, wondering why he felt so empty despite having everything he ever wanted. He chalked it up to stress or the pressures of leadership. But deep down, he suspected there was something more. A nagging voice whispered that perhaps he had made choices he couldn't undo, choices that left scars not only on others but on himself as well. Little did he know, those scars were about to resurface in ways he couldn't anticipate. Unknown to Charles, the young man making waves in the financial district shared more than just ambition with him. They carried the same resilience, the same hunger for success, and unbeknownst to either of them, the same bloodline. Destiny had set its course, and soon, paths that diverged long ago would cross again, forcing everyone involved to confront the truths they'd buried for so long. For Evelyn, the days ahead promised both challenges and revelations. For her son, they held the promise of discovery and growth. And for Charles, they threatened to unravel the carefully constructed facade he'd lived behind for decades. None of them could foresee exactly how their lives would intertwine, but one thing was certain: the past had a way of catching up, no matter how far you tried to run from it. The young man's rise in the financial district was nothing short of impressive. Within months of joining his firm, he had earned a reputation for being sharp, dependable, and innovative. His ability to analyze complex data and present clear, actionable solutions made him stand out among his peers. It wasn't long before senior partners began assigning him to high-profile projects that required collaboration with other major companies. One such project brought him face-to-face with Charles's conglomerate. The two firms were partnering on a large-scale initiative aimed at streamlining operations across multiple industries. As part of the deal, representatives from both sides needed to meet regularly to ensure smooth communication and alignment. Naturally, the young man was chosen to lead his team's efforts. Thanks to his track record and natural leadership skills, when the day of the first meeting arrived, he dressed carefully, wanting to make a good impression. He wore a well-tailored navy suit, polished shoes, and a crisp white shirt. Confidence radiated from him as he walked into the conference room where the meeting was set to take place. But when he entered, his eyes landed on the man sitting at the head of the table, Charles. Charles barely glanced up as the young man introduced himself. To Charles, he was just another ambitious professional trying to climb the corporate ladder. There was no reason for him to suspect anything unusual about this encounter. After exchanging pleasantries, they dove straight into business, discussing timelines, budgets, and strategies. The young man spoke eloquently, presenting his ideas with clarity and conviction. But something about him caught Charles's attention. At first, it was subtle, a fleeting sense of familiarity in the way the young man carried himself. Then came the voice, which struck a chord deep within Charles's memory. It wasn't identical, but there was an echo, a tone that felt hauntingly recognizable. Charles shook it off initially, chalking it up to coincidence or fatigue. Still, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. As the meeting progressed, the young man shared anecdotes about his upbringing, mentioning how he grew up without a father figure but found strength through his mother's resilience. Those words hit Charles like a punch to the gut. For a brief moment, his mind flashed back to Evelyn, the woman he had wronged years ago. Could it be possible? No, he told himself firmly. That chapter of his life was closed. This was just some overachieving kid making small talk. Despite his unease, Charles couldn't deny the young man's talent. By the end of the meeting, he found himself impressed, not just by the ideas presented, but by the person delivering them. There was a quiet confidence, a determination that reminded him of someone he used to know. Yet Charles pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. After the meeting concluded, the young man left the room feeling satisfied with how things had gone. He hadn't noticed anything particularly strange about Charles, beyond the usual air of authority that came with running a massive company. But as he stepped into the elevator, he felt a strange pull, a sense that their paths crossing wasn't entirely random. Shaking off the thought, he returned to his office, eager to prepare for the next phase of the project. Back in his penthouse later that evening, Charles poured himself a glass of whiskey and sank into his leather chair. Try as he might, he couldn't stop thinking about the young man. Something about him lingered in Charles's mind, refusing to let go. Was it the way he tilted his head while listening? Or the intensity in his gaze when he spoke? Whatever it was, it unsettled Charles in a way he hadn't felt in years. Curiosity got the better of him. The next morning, Charles asked his assistant to dig up information about the young man. "Find out everything you can," he instructed, masking his request with casual curiosity. "I want to know who we're dealing with." By the end of the day, a detailed report landed on Charles's desk. It included basic details, education, work history, notable achievements, but also mentioned that the young man had grown up in a small town outside the city, raised solely by his mother. Reading those words sent a chill down Charles's spine. Small town, raised by a single mother. It was too close to home. His mind raced as fragments of memories surfaced, memories he had buried long ago. Evelyn's face appeared in his thoughts, followed by the night she told him she was pregnant. The guilt he had suppressed for decades resurfaced with startling clarity. Could it really be? Could the young man be Charles dismissed the idea almost immediately. Surely it was impossible. Too much time had passed, and besides, Evelyn would never have kept something like that from him, if indeed the child was his. Still, doubt gnawed at him. What if? Meanwhile, the young man continued working on the project, unaware of the storm brewing in Charles's mind. He threw himself into the tasks assigned to him, determined to prove his worth. Each interaction with Charles added layers to their dynamic. On the surface, they maintained a professional rapport, but beneath it, there was an undercurrent of tension neither could fully explain. During one particularly intense discussion, Charles leaned forward, studying the young man intently. "You remind me of someone," he said suddenly, breaking the flow of conversation. The young man raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh? Who's that?" Charles hesitated, unsure how to respond. Finally, he shrugged. "Just someone I used to know. A long time ago." Their eyes met briefly, and for a split second, the young man sensed there was more to Charles's comment than met the ear. But before he could press further, Charles redirected the conversation back to business. That night, as the young man reviewed notes from the meeting, his thoughts drifted to his mother. She had always been tight-lipped about his father, offering only vague explanations whenever he asked. Over the years he had stopped prying, respecting her privacy. But now, sitting alone in his apartment, he wondered if there was more to the story than she had ever let on. Little did he know, the pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, not just for him, but for Charles as well. Fate had orchestrated this meeting, weaving threads of the past into the fabric of the present. Neither man realized it yet, but their lives were intertwined in ways neither could have imagined. And soon, the truth would come crashing down, forcing them both to confront the secrets they had tried so desperately to leave behind. For now, though they remained locked in a delicate dance, one fueled by ambition, curiosity, and an unspoken connection neither fully understood, the stage was set and the clock was ticking. All that remained was for the curtain to rise, revealing the drama hidden beneath the surface. The young man couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Charles's behavior during their meetings had shifted subtly but noticeably. At first, it was just a lingering glance or an awkward pause in conversation. But as days turned into weeks, those moments grew more frequent, almost deliberate. It was as if Charles was studying him, not just his words, but his mannerisms, the way he carried himself, even the tone of his voice. At first, the young man brushed it off as nothing more than Charles being overly meticulous about the project. After all, Charles was known for his attention to detail and high standards. But deep down, a seed of curiosity began to grow. Why did Charles seem so fixated on him? Was it admiration for his work? Or was there something else beneath the surface? Meanwhile, Charles was spiraling into a whirlpool of emotions he hadn't felt in years. The report his assistant had compiled only fueled his suspicions. The details matched too perfectly his mother raising him alone, growing up in a small town, excelling academically despite challenges. Each piece of information tugged at memories Charles had tried so hard to bury. And then there were the physical similarities, the jawline, the way he gestured with his hands when he spoke, the intensity in his eyes. They weren't glaringly obvious, but they were there, subtle yet undeniable. Charles wrestled with the possibility that this young man could be his son. He replayed every interaction they'd had, searching for clues he might have missed. Doubt gnawed at him, but so did fear. What would it mean if his suspicions were true? How would Evelyn react? More importantly, how would the young man feel knowing the truth? Would he hate him, reject him outright? Or worse, demand answers Charles wasn't ready to give? One evening, unable to sleep, Charles sat in his dimly lit study nursing a glass. of whiskey. His mind raced with questions, scenarios, and worst-case outcomes. Finally, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in decades. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" Evelyn's tone was cautious, tinged with surprise. For a moment, Charles hesitated. Hearing her voice after all these years stirred emotions he thought he'd buried forever. "Evelyn," he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "We need to talk." There was a long silence on the other end. When she finally spoke, her words were clipped. "What do you want, Charles?" "I think—" He paused, unsure how to phrase what he needed to say. "I think I've met someone who might change things." Another pause. Then, sharply, "What are you talking about?" Charles took a deep breath. "There's a young man working on our joint project. He reminds me of us, of you. And I can't help but wonder." Evelyn's sharp intake of breath cut through the line. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said, firmly, "You don't get to do this, Charles. You don't get to dig up the past because it's convenient for you now." "I'm not trying to hurt anyone," Charles insisted, though even he wasn't sure if he believed his own words. "I just need to know. If he's my son, you abandoned him." Evelyn snapped, her voice trembling with anger. "You fired me, humiliated Emmy, and walked away without a second thought. Do you really think you deserve to waltz back into his life like some long-lost hero?" Charles winced, guilt pressing down on him like a weight. "I know I messed up, Evelyn. I know I hurt you, but maybe this is my chance to make things right." "Making things right doesn't start with you," Evelyn shot back. "It starts with respecting boundaries, and right now, your curiosity isn't worth risking his peace of mind." The call ended abruptly, leaving Charles staring at his phone, his heart pounding. He knew Evelyn was right, he had no claim to the life he had rejected years ago. But the ache inside him refused to fade. He wanted to reach out, to explain, to somehow bridge the gap he had created. Yet, he also knew any move he made could shatter the fragile balance Evelyn had worked so hard to build for her son. Unaware of the storm brewing behind closed doors, the young man continued navigating his professional journey. His interactions with Charles remained polite but distant, marked by an unspoken tension neither fully understood. One day, while reviewing documents for the next phase of the project, he stumbled upon an old press clipping tucked inside a folder. It was a photo of Charles at a gala, standing beside a woman who looked strikingly familiar. His breath caught. The woman in the picture was his mother, or at least someone who bore an uncanny resemblance to her. Confusion washed over him as he stared at the image. Why would his mother be photographed with Charles? What connection did they share? That night, he called Evelyn. She answered cheerfully, as always, but her tone changed when he asked about the photo. "Where did you see that?" she asked, her voice suddenly guarded. "At work," he replied. "Mom, why were you at a gala with Charles Whitmore? Did you know him?" There was a long pause before Evelyn sighed deeply. "Yes, I knew him," she admitted reluctantly, "a long time ago." Her hesitation only fueled his curiosity. "What happened between you two?" Evelyn hesitated again, weighing her words carefully. She had spent years protecting him from the truth, shielding him from the pain of abandonment. But now, faced with his probing questions, she realized she couldn't keep hiding it forever. Taking a deep breath, she began to tell him everything. She started with how she and Charles had met at a company event where their professional admiration turned into something more personal. She described the excitement of falling in love, followed by the devastation of discovering she was pregnant. Her voice trembled as she recounted the betrayal, the accusations, the firing, the humiliation. By the time she finished, tears streamed down her face, and her son sat in stunned silence. "So, he's my father?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn nodded, though he couldn't see her. "Yes," she said softly. "But I never told you because I didn't want you to carry the burden of his mistakes. You deserve better than that." Her honesty struck a chord within him. Anger bubbled up initially, directed at Charles for abandoning them, but it quickly gave way to a burning desire for answers. He needed to confront Charles, to look him in the eye and demand the truth. The next day, he requested another meeting under the guise of discussing the project. When he entered Charles's office, however, his demeanor was different. Gone was the polished professionalism. Instead, he radiated raw emotion. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Before Charles could respond, he placed a folder on the desk and slid it toward him. Inside were DNA test results confirming their biological relationship. Charles froze, staring at the document in disbelief. His worst fears and wildest hopes had come true. The young man standing before him was indeed his son. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Charles looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt, fear, and something resembling hope. "I didn't know," he whispered hoarsely. "If I had known—" "But you didn't," the young man interrupted, his voice firm. "And even if you did, would it have changed anything? You chose your empire over us. That's not something I can forgive easily." Charles flinched, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. He had spent years building wealth and power, yet in that moment he realized how hollow it all felt. The son he never knew existed stood before him, demanding accountability, and Charles had no defense. "I don't expect forgiveness," Charles said finally, his voice trembling. "But I want to try to make amends, to be part of your life, if you'll let me." The young man studied him for a long moment, searching for sincerity in his expression. Finally, he nodded slowly. "We'll see," he said simply. "But this isn't going to be easy for either of us." As he left the office, Charles sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had just transpired. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his choices. Redemption wouldn't come easily, but perhaps, just perhaps, it wasn't entirely out of reach. The days following the confrontation in Charles's office were heavy with tension. The young man walked away feeling a mix of emotions, anger, confusion, and an unexpected flicker of hope. He had spent his entire life imagining what it might be like to have a father figure, only to discover that the man who could have filled that role had chosen to walk away. Now, faced with the reality of Charles's presence, he wasn't sure how to move forward. For Charles, the weight of revelation pressed down on him harder than ever before. Every decision he had made in his life suddenly seemed tainted by selfishness and short-sightedness. His empire, once a source of immense pride, now felt hollow without meaningful connections to anchor it. He couldn't undo the past, but he realized he had two choices: retreat into denial or take responsibility for the mess he had created. Evelyn, meanwhile, watched from afar as her son grappled with this newfound truth. She wanted nothing more than to shield him from further pain, but she also knew he needed space to process everything. Her own feelings about Charles resurfaced: anger, hurt, and a lingering sadness for the love they had lost so many years ago. Still, she resolved to support her son no matter what path he chose. Charles didn't wait long before reaching out again. This time, his approach was different. Instead of grand gestures or empty promises, he sent a simple email asking for permission to meet. "I understand if you don't want to see me," he wrote, "but I'd like the chance to explain myself, to tell you my side of the story." The young man hesitated before responding. Part of him wanted to shut Charles out completely, to let him stew in the consequences of his actions. But another part, a quieter, more curious voice, urged him to listen. After all, understanding where someone came from didn't mean excusing their behavior. It simply meant gaining clarity. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe downtown, far removed from the corporate world that defined both their lives. When Charles arrived, he looked older somehow, not just physically, but emotionally. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that hadn't been there during their previous encounters. "Thank you for coming," Charles began, his voice softer than usual. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I'm grateful for it." The young man nodded curtly, signaling for him to continue. Charles took a deep breath and launched into his explanation. He spoke about his childhood, a lonely upbringing marked by neglect and pressure to succeed. He admitted that fear had driven many of his decisions, including abandoning Evelyn and their unborn child. "I convinced myself I was protecting my future," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "But looking back, I see how wrong I was. I let fear dictate my life instead of doing the right thing." It wasn't an excuse, it was an admission. And while it didn't erase the years of absence, it offered context. The young man listened intently, weighing each word carefully. By the end of the conversation, he still felt anger simmering beneath the surface, but he also noticed something else, a glimmer of possibility. Maybe Charles truly regretted his actions. Maybe redemption was within reach, not just for Charles, but for both of them. Over the next few months, their relationship evolved cautiously. Charles made no demands, offering instead small gestures of goodwill. He invited the young man to dinner, sent thoughtful messages checking in, and even reached out to Evelyn, though she remained guarded. Slowly but surely, trust began to build between father and son. One evening, after a particularly productive meeting at work, Charles approached the young man with an offer. "I'd like you to join my company," he said earnestly. "Not because I feel obligated, but because I believe in your talent. You're smart, driven, and capable of achieving incredible things. I want to give you the opportunity to shine." At first, the young man balked. Accepting a position under Charles's wing felt too much like dependency, like forgiving him too easily. But then he remembered something his mother had always told him. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, it's about choosing to move forward. He accepted the offer, not out of obligation, but because he saw it as a chance to hold Charles accountable from within. If Charles truly wanted to change, he would have to prove it through action, not words. Working together wouldn't be easy, but it would provide a unique opportunity for growth for both of them. As weeks turned into months, the dynamic between father and son shifted. They weren't exactly close, but they were learning to navigate their complicated bond. Charles worked tirelessly to earn his son's respect, showing up consistently and proving himself trustworthy. In return, the young man allowed himself to open up little, sharing glimpses of his life outside work and occasionally seeking advice. Evelyn observed these developments with cautious optimism. While she still harbored resentment toward Charles, she couldn't deny the positive impact his efforts were having on her son. For the first time in years, she saw a lightness in his demeanor, a sense of closure he hadn't experienced before. One evening, over dinner at her home, she confronted Charles directly. "You've done well so far," she admitted, surprising both of them. "But don't think for a second that this absolves you of the past. Your son has given you a second chance, and it's up to you to honor that." Charles nodded solemnly. "I know," he replied, "and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make things right." The story concluded not with dramatic resolution, but with gradual healing. Charles continued working to rebuild bridges, not just with his son, but with others he had wronged along the way. He stepped back from some of his leadership roles, allowing younger voices, including his sons, to shape the future of his company. It was a humbling experience, one that taught him the value of humility and connection over power and control. The young man, now thriving in his new role, found peace in knowing he had confronted the ghosts of his past. He carried his mother's strength and resilience with him every day, using it as fuel to forge his own legacy. Though scars remained, they served as reminders of how far he and his family had come. In the end, forgiveness didn't erase the pain of abandonment, nor did it rewrite history. But it opened the door to something greater, a chance to heal, to grow, and to create a future unburdened by the mistakes of the past. And sometimes that was enough.